Welcome to the Inside Elections podcast, where we analyze elections in a nonpartisan, data-driven, and accessible way. In this episode, we'll talk about the historic developments at the top of the Democratic presidential ticket, who might be the new Democratic vice presidential nominee, and what our exclusive polling in Ohio's 9th District has to say about that crucial Midwestern swing seat. And we'll do it all with help from a familiar face. Buckle up. I'm Jacob Rubashkin, Deputy Editor of Inside Elections, the go-to place for nonpartisan political analysis for more than 40 years. And I've spent the last couple days watching the Summer Olympics, where I have a particular eye on Katie Ledecky, who, like me, is from Maryland, and not just Maryland, but the 8th Congressional District.
And I'm Nathan Gonzales, editor and publisher of Inside Elections, and I've been rooting for gold medal winning gymnast Jade Carey because she also attends Oregon State University and is an Oregon State Beaver, which is located in Oregon's 4th District.
And I'm Leah Askarinam from the Associated Press, and I didn't know that we were choosing Olympians from individual congressional districts. But I did just spend the last couple weeks out in the wilderness in Maine's, mostly in Maine's 2nd District, a little bit in the 1st District.
That's right. This is an ambush, Leah. We should. I'm sure they're lovely Olympians,
and where they're from, and their member of Congress.
Well, if overperforming the top of the ticket was an Olympic sport, then Maine's 2nd District Jared Golden would probably be maybe not the gold medalist now that Peltola's on the scene, but certainly in line for the silver.
Very nice tie-in.
That's how we do it here at Inside Elections. Before we get into the meat of our conversation, let's just touch on a few tidbits from congressional news in the last week. Nathan, what else has been going on? Walk us through the primary results we saw in Arizona last night.
Yes, we're recording on Wednesday morning. There are a number of uncalled House races as votes are still counted, but we now know officially that the U.S. Senate race will be between Republican Kari Lake and Democrat Ruben Gallego. Like I said, votes are still being counted. It looks like an underwhelming primary victory for Kari Lake against Sheriff Mark Lamb, which was foreseen by our polling partners, Noble Predictive Insights, who are based in Arizona. So we'll see, but this is one of the top Senate races in the country. We have it rated at Inside Elections as tilt Democratic. It's a must-win for Democrats if they want to maintain control of the Senate.
And we're still waiting on primary results in Arizona's 1st District for the Democrats deciding who they're going to take on David Schweikert with, and Republicans in the 8th District to replace retiring Congresswoman Debbie Lesko in that solidly Republican seat. But let's move on to our main stories.
So as Leah told you, before I was elected vice president, before I was elected United States Senator, I was elected Attorney General of the state of California, and I was a courtroom prosecutor before then. And in those roles, I took on perpetrators of all kinds. Predators who abused women, fraudsters who ripped off consumers, cheaters who broke the rules for their own gain. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type.
So that was Vice President Kamala Harris in her first speech as the new Democratic standard bearer following President Joe Biden's surprise decision to drop out of the race last Sunday. Harris held a rally in Milwaukee a couple days after she officially launched her presidential bid. But there are still a few procedural steps that she has to go through before she is officially the Democratic nominee. Leah, you have been tracking all of this stuff for quite a long time. Walk us through what has to happen now within the Democratic Party for Harris to actually become the presumptive nominee, and then in a couple weeks, the official nominee in this presidential election.
So all of the pieces are in place for Kamala Harris to be the Democratic nominee. Last night, there was another development that Harris will be the only candidate who actually qualifies to be considered for the nomination. In order to be considered, you have to receive a petition of at least 300 delegates. And the DNC announced that Harris has surpassed like 3,900 at this point. So she is the only candidate who is officially running, the only candidate who has enough signatures, enough delegates petitioning on her behalf in order to win the nomination. And we've also done our own analysis, counting delegates and reaching out to individual pledge delegates who became uncommitted, basically, when Biden dropped out of the race. And through our own analysis, talking to individual delegates and hearing from announcements from individual delegations, Harris does have enough proclaimed support to win the nomination. However, she is still going to the roll call, which I think is going to take place, which we know is going to take place before the actual convention, without delegates pledged to her. These are not based on primary results. And so I'm not calling her the presumptive nominee. I'm calling her the likely nominee because unlike, if Biden had been continued to be in the race, he would have all of those delegates pledged to him. And what we're going on now is really what delegates are telling us, which will probably end up with the same outcome, but some technical differences.
I think we take for granted now that we're, 10 days into this process, which feels like an eternity, that Harris has locked down so much of that support. I think her campaign said she had commitments from 99% of DNC delegates heading into this roll call. But I don't want to lose sight of how uncertain or not preordained this outcome was when Biden dropped out. I think it is surprising to me still on some level that everyone really did coalesce around Harris to the degree that they did and in the speed that they did. Nathan, what did you think watching everything go down on Sunday and then the next 2 days in which Harris locked down support from the party? Did it surprise you as much that she was able to so quickly establish herself as the new de facto nominee?
It wasn't a surprise that she was the replacement or the new candidate, but the speed, it feels like nothing happens quickly in politics. Nothing happens quickly on Capitol Hill. Everything is just a slog. And so in that regard, I do think that it is a surprise, but it showed that Democrats are ready and were ready to move on from Biden. It wasn't that they disliked Biden, that they wanted someone else to go into this fight. And we're seeing a dramatic uptick in energy in the Democratic Party. Not only the rallies that Harris has already had, volunteers, fundraising, we're starting to see it show up in polling. And that is one of the two key pieces that Harris and the Democrats needed in order to win or get back into the competitive presidential race, right? You need an excited base, and Harris has consolidated and energized the Democratic base very quickly. Then it's going to be about independent voters. And that's the unknown right now. We're probably going back to the 6 or 7 key swing states. What do independent voters think? And even if the polling doesn't show a dramatic difference in the race right now, her candidacy has upended the race in that it has totally changed the narrative, before Biden dropped out, all we were talking about was Biden. Biden, he's old, he's old, he's old. And now it's a little more nuanced. It's a little more of a even conversation between the vision or the record that Harris has or is giving and Trump and the vision that he's casting or his record in the past. And that's better terrain for Democrats than where we were before Biden dropped out.
Everything seems to be going right for Democrats over the last 10 days. I think that they have hit their marks consistently since Biden dropped out, and they have another at least 2 opportunities to keep that momentum going. We anticipate a vice presidential pick to be rolled out in the next couple of days. We'll talk about that a bit. Then we've got the convention shortly thereafter. All of this ultimately seems very well timed on Democrats' parts. And I do wonder, I don't have any special insight into Biden's thinking, but the fact that he did it when he did, he dropped out when he did, following the RNC and then endorsing Harris so quickly, seems to have set the party up for a really strong 6 weeks if they can execute everything and start September with a full head of steam. But the speed at which things are happening is still, I mean, we're just a month and 4 days out from the debate. We're 2 weeks and a couple days out from the assassination attempt, 2 weeks from the J.D. Vance selection. I mean, what's going to happen next, right?
Like the October surprise, the September surprise, the late August surprise. No, I mean, I think this isn't the speed part, I think isn't fully unprecedented, because we saw something similar with Democrats getting behind Biden in 2020, right? Like there was a kind of long primary, a divisive in a lot of ways primary. I mean, Harris going after Biden on the debate stage pretty intensely, and then all of a sudden, Democrats coming together around him. This kind of organization, I guess, has happened. But I do want to draw a difference between, I mean, the delegates who are supporting Harris, who had been previously pledged to Biden. I mean, I had been talking to a handful of them before Biden dropped out, and I can't really emphasize enough how the people who are pledged to Biden, who are attending who were planning to attend the convention on his behalf, how much they loved him. And I think I remember like seeing an interview with, I forget who it was, maybe it was Lester Holt, telling Biden, like, you know, people say they love you, but they want you to drop out. And I remember thinking like, oh, well, that's a nice way to like couch the question. But like really, they did. And this isn't all of them. This is just, you know, a handful. There are 4,000 delegates. But they loved him. And I think when he decided that it was going to be Harris instead of him, they were going to go along with what Biden said. What is more surprising to me is how quickly public opinion in the Democratic Party has shifted as well. The pledged delegates, it makes sense. They were going to listen to what Biden said. What we're seeing from the Democratic Party, I mean, we have a poll out today that has 8 out of 10 Democrats are satisfied with their nominee, which, I mean, it would if you were to guess that percentage, if you knew that Harris was going to be the nominee all of a sudden in July, if we asked you this a few months ago, would you have expected that? And we have seen, you know, a slight increase in her approval or in her favorability rating as well. So yeah, I think it's wild how fast this is all happening. The timing is weird, and what's going to happen the next 98, 97 days.
And I expect Biden's job approval rating to go up because of Democrats who approve of him bowing out of the race, right? It wasn't that they suddenly feel differently about his record on other things, but they approve of what he did, and they are ready to take on. They're ready to take on Trump. And it's amazing that Democrats have sort of stumbled into this timing, because there are a number of Democrats who wish Biden would have done this a long time ago. And yet this does appear to be good timing, in part because it was Trump's vice presidential pick was made at a time, a very different time in the election, even though it was just a few weeks before. And Jacob, you've talked about this both in articles and on Twitter about how that choice was made at a time of extreme confidence on the Republican side. They didn't feel like they needed to expand the tent at all. And now they might have to, because there's a choice now for voters who didn't like that it was two old white guys in the race. Now Democrats are offering an alternative. For voters who didn't like it was a 2020 matchup, now Democrats are offering an alternative. And so it's a very different race now.
I'll just note on July 7th in the 538 tracker, Kamala Harris's image rating was 36% favorable, 54% unfavorable. So a minus 18, basically. Today, her rating is 42% favorable, 50% favorable. So just a 7% underwater. So she's already collapsed her image by 11 points in the positive direction. And that trend line is only getting more and more positive for her. I think so much of the coverage ahead of the switch was predicated on the notion that Harris was going to be just as unpopular as Biden. And that was part of the consternation among some Democrats about Biden dropping out, that with her as the clearest alternative, people were unsure if she would be any better. And what we're seeing now, at least initially, is that voters are reacting to her differently as the Democratic leader, as the Democratic candidate, than they were when she was Biden's number 2. So very interesting to see if that trend continues. But I want to turn now to the next big development in this race, the next big decision that Harris is going to have to make, maybe her first really big decision as the new likely nominee. I'll use the AP-approved terminology here.
We have to have Leah stay on the rest of this episode, so don't offend her.
And that is, of course, the vice presidential selection.
And every single day, I've put people before the powerful. I learned that from all of you. I learned that from the conversations we had in your living rooms and on our farmlands and in our coffee shops. I learned from you what is necessary to be able to deliver for the good people of Pennsylvania. You know who else I learned that from? From a good friend of mine for nearly 20 years, the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris. Because, listen, she is someone who has always been for the people. I knew her when she was a courtroom prosecutor. And let me tell you something, she is tough as nails.
Look, it was so surprising. You know, these super successful Donald Trump, who inherited $400 million and then proceeded to fail at everything. Middle America, you earn it, but you know what? You're not on your own. Neighbors help neighbors. And I will, this one bothers me. I heard you talking about punching back at the bullies. They see people less fortunate as scapegoats and you know, punchlines for their jokes. We see them as neighbors. And I said it with my mom. My dad dies when my little brother's young. We're teenagers. We get Social Security survivor benefits. I'm all for pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. We didn't have any boots. Social Security was the boots, and we pulled ourselves up, and we paid that back. And I think J.D. Vance gets none of that. You know, it's the aw shucks, I'm from here or whatever. So my hillbilly cousins did not go to Yale, but I'll tell you what they did. They contributed to our community, and they're proud of it.
Who's going to be the next Democratic vice presidential nominee?
No pressure. It feels like it's going to be Shapiro. I still think it should be Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona. I get it with Shapiro. He's a rising star. He won. He had a convincing win in a key state, a must-win state for Democrats, for Harris in order to win. I cringed a little bit yesterday when I was watching CNN, and there was some analysis that we're doing right now, and it mentioned how much Shapiro had overperformed Biden in his governor's race. It failed to mention that Shapiro ran against one of the worst statewide candidates in Pennsylvania history, if not U.S. history, in Doug Mastriano. And I'm not meaning to take away from Shapiro. He's he looks like he is a up and coming star. He's the governor of Pennsylvania, for goodness sake, but that context is a little bit missing. And to me, whether it's Shapiro, Bashir, we know now it's not going to be Roy Cooper. Those feel like, or Tim Walz, those feel like safe picks. But to me, Senator Kelly makes more sense because of his profile. For those of you that are not familiar, he's a former astronaut, captain in the Navy, military pilot, married to Gabby Giffords. To me, when voters hear about that, the voters outside of Arizona, where he represents, will give him a second look or give the whole ticket a second look. I'm just not sure that Shapiro, people in Arizona or Nevada are going to be, oh my goodness, Josh Shapiro, like, let me take a second look. The ticket, Harris won't lose because of them, but I'm not sure it expands the conversation.
No, it's a weird time. I mean, speaking of this compressed timeline and Harris's kind of improvement in, at least in Democrats' eyes, it's a weird time to be kind of deciding the shape of the future of her campaign, partially because we don't know if what she's experiencing now is, as Nathan will tell you, if it's a bump, or if it's a new trend, because we are still in the midst. It just happened. And as Nathan has taught us well, you gotta wait for the dust to settle. You gotta see what's gonna, or I should say, indoctrinated. But we don't really like. What are Harris's real strengths going to be and what are her real weaknesses going to be? The fun part about this kind of week is that we've all been kind of covering these down ballot races. And so, like Nathan said, we kind of know the weird things that some of these potential vice presidential picks, like what their backstories are and why they overperformed and how they perform on the stump. And, Shapiro's last race was really not all that competitive. Mark Kelly obviously was a much tougher race. He had a lot more to overcome in terms of just the partisanship of the state of Arizona. But he also had, some interesting kind of matchups. So, how much can you use these previous performances to judge the potential success of a vice presidential kind of appointment? And when I say success, I mean, how are they going to be perceived? And I think J.D. Vance might have been a potential warning sign, because if you covered that race, you knew that J.D. Vance underperformed Republicans. And now we are seeing, he has not had the same kind of rousing support or growing support that maybe we would have, or maybe the Republican Party would have wanted. Though, as Nathan said, what's the vice presidential pick? How much is it really going to change the race, unless it's some kind of massive error, or
I think vice presidential picks, I don't really think they, outside of very rare circumstances, win people races. I think more often you're trying not to lose a race. You don't want yourself in a Palin 08 situation where your pick just becomes such a liability. But I guess I'm also in the school that elections are won and lost by the president and the presidential nominee, not by the VP. But certainly, Leah, you bring up a good point about J.D. Vance. All the coverage about Vance's comments about cat ladies and some of his stranger policy positions, we're all out there. He wasn't saying these things anonymously on message boards or something like that. He was saying them on Tucker Carlson. He was saying them on primetime Fox News. And a lot of that was a part of the 2022 Ohio Senate campaign. There is a reason why it took $18 million from Peter Thiel and a Trump endorsement to get Vance into position to win that primary, and why it took $40 million from the Mitch McConnell Super PAC Senate Leadership Fund to get him past Tim Ryan, the Democrat, in Ohio in a midterm year, even as the rest of his party was winning their races statewide by double digits. So clearly, and I wrote about this a little bit, Vance does not bring any sort of electoral strength to the ticket. That was not his advantage. There were other candidates Trump could have picked if he thought that he needed to win this election, but he thought that he had already won this election and that he was setting himself up for 2028 and the MAGA movement for 2028. And that's what Vance offered 2 weeks ago when he was picked. And now it's a very different thing that he's dealing with.
I was on a flight yesterday coming back from Charleston, had a speaking event, and on my flight was Senator Tim Scott, and I wanted to say, we weren't sitting next to each other, but I wanted to say he should have picked you, but the senator, he was tied up, and I didn't want to just interject myself, into the conversation that he was clearly having. But Trump must hate what is going on right now, not necessarily that he disagrees with Vance's positions, but just that it is taking up so much attention and so much oxygen in the race, and that's not productive. And Trump wants to be the center of attention himself. So, and there was a lot of questions like, why didn't they do vetting? I wonder, they may not have found everything, but for the Republicans vetting J.D. Vance, they might not have really disagreed with some of the rhetoric or the things that he was saying. So we're not talking about some abstract or something criminal or otherwise. It's a policy position that some Republicans probably heard him say it on Tucker Carlson. Like, yeah, okay, I agree with that. So that's part of why it just slipped through.
Right. And Ohio voters heard that stuff in 2022 and still voted for him. So you can imagine kind of knowing that I mean, I don't even know if it's considered opposition research because it was just out there. And I mean, I was personally a little taken aback by the negative response, just because we had seen in the Ohio Senate race, obviously J.D. Vance was not the star candidate or Republican nominee of the season, but he still managed to win that over. And I guess it's just another example of this is a completely different kind of race. It's not even, we say, when somebody runs from the House to the Senate, like, oh, you don't actually understand what this is going to be like. Now we're doing this on a presidential stage. I am kind of surprised, Nathan, that you're not more gung-ho, let's say, on Tim Walz as a potential vice president. I mean, I just had to look up his 2018 race because it was not the most high profile of the blue wave year. But why not Tim Walz?
Well, I was a doubter. Jacob was actually he put Tim Walz on my radar. I hate that term, but I just used it. Before Tim Walz, it was cool before Tim Walz was even the dark horse candidate in the race. And he has, there are a lot of attractive qualities. He's, I think, knocking it out of the park on his media interviews and the way he delivers the message that Democrats want to deliver. He have a likability and he's affable. And I think that he could be an asset. I kind of come back to what I was saying before. I don't think Harris is going to lose because of him. How much does that get her electorally? I don't know, but it would be. I think he would be a good pick.
I was just curious. I was just, it's Minnesota. And I think it does also bring up, I mean, this reminds me that Mark Kelly, again, very strong in a Senate race. His ads, I think, have been really persuasive. His profile on paper, like, it's just kind of the ideal resume. Throw on the word astronaut and it's like, all of a sudden it's like Democrat, Republican, astronaut, independent. Like, you can kind of have astronaut as its own kind of label. But how does Mark Kelly do kind of on a national stage? How does he do on the stump? How does he do in a debate against J.D. Vance? These are all things that I think are just more unknown, that you can't know. Like with J.D. Vance, you can't know until you get on the national stage, and not just on Fox News national stage, like the presidential race.
To give you a sense of the difference in scale between a Senate race and a presidential. We talk about Mark Kelly. Mark Kelly is one of the best fundraisers in the Democratic Party. He clearly has a knack for it. People like his profile. He has those nationwide connections from his wife, former Representative Gabby Giffords, and the work that they've done in the gun control space. Mark Kelly ran in two of the biggest Senate races of the cycle in 2020 and 2022 and raised a total of about $190 million. A ton of money. Kamala Harris raised $200 million for her presidential election in 1 week.
Yep.
In 1 week. So Kelly is a great fundraiser. Presidential fundraising, totally different picture. That's not to say that he wouldn't be an asset to Harris's fundraising or whatever, but I just think it's always important to keep a sense of scale between a Senate campaign and a presidential race.
Yeah. Just FYI, people can sponsor this podcast for less than that. Our rates are slightly less than that, so you can reach out to me.
Just $189.99 million.
Just a little under. I wasn't lying. I know we're going to talk about our Ohio poll, but we'd be remiss if we didn't say that Harris, the current pace, or Harris at the top of the ticket, has changed, has improved Democrats' outlook in the House and the Senate. With Biden at the top, it was a sinking ship. Democrats were still treading water. House and Senate Democrats were still treading, but they were at significant risk of Biden just pulling them down. Now that there's evidence that Harris is at least going to be competitive, will remain to be seen whether she can actually reach or exceed Biden's 2020 performance. But if she can do that, then that keeps that narrow path for Senate Democrats to maintain control. It keeps the path open for Democrats to get the 4 seats that they need to get the majority back in the House. And so this was a critical decision, not only improve Democratic chances of winning the White House, but also help them down the ballot.
Are you basing that analysis on just the general fact that, it's harder to outrun the top of the ticket, or are you seeing polling in individual House races that's actually beginning to change? I was just wondering because, we did see a little bit in 2016 of that, we think Hillary Clinton's going to win, so we're going to vote for Republican down ballot to balance it out. I'm curious what data you're thinking about.
It is slowly coming. The district and state level data is slowly coming, but even this is a case where I think you can take what we're seeing in the national polls, meaning the Democratic consolidation and the qualitative stuff on the energy piece, that if she can just consolidate Democratic voters, that's going to get her to a better ballot position performance-wise than where Biden was. But it's still, we're waiting. I'd like to see a lot more state and district level data in order to flesh it out.
Well, and this is a great segue because we actually have some district level data that I believe is the first House level polling to test Harris versus Trump in the time when Harris is actually the Democratic de facto nominee. So let's get into the exclusive polling that Inside Elections rolled out today. This is Wednesday in Ohio's 9th congressional district.
So tired of the status quo. They want change. They want new leadership. And I decided to step up to the plate and give people an opportunity for that new leadership. We've had the same Congresswoman for over 40 years, and our founding fathers never intended for people to sit in Congress for that long.
That was Ohio Republican Derek Marin on the eve of his primary win in Ohio's 9th congressional district. He has the opportunity now to take on one of the more vulnerable Democrats, Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur. She is the longest serving woman in congressional history. She's held this Northwest Ohio seat since 1983. Now, we at Inside Elections partnered with Noble Predictive Insights, a nonpartisan polling and research firm out in Arizona, to conduct a survey of Ohio's 9th district general election as part of a series we're doing on the most competitive House battleground districts. So let's get into what we found here, because contrary to what we saw a couple weeks ago on our Michigan 7 poll, this one actually has some positive news for Democrats. Top line level, Marcy Kaptur is leading Derek Merrin, her Republican opponent, by 10 points, 47% to 37%. At the presidential level, Vice President Harris and former President Trump are tied at 46% apiece. In the head-to-head, they're also tied at, I believe, 44% apiece, with the third-party candidates included on the ballot. And in the Senate race between Senator Sherrod Brown, the Democrat, and Republican Bernie Moreno, Brown is ahead in this district by 13 points, 49% to 36%. Now, this poll was conducted July 22nd to July 24th. That's right after Harris assumed the mantle of the Democratic nominee. 435 likely voters contacted by text and live caller. But this is all in a district that Trump carried by 3 points in 2020. This is a 80% white district with only 26% college educated population. I think in our sample, it was even lower, just 20% college educated. And yet Democrats are holding their own in the presidential and doing more than that in the House and Senate. Nathan, when you got these results a couple days ago, how did they hit your ears? Were you surprised by what you saw?
Maybe not surprised, but it was a little bit of whiplash from that poll in Michigan 7 that was taken after the debate at a time when Democrats were in a very, very different position. And so to see tangible results was striking. And to give people a little bit behind the scenes, we were working on this script with NPI, and thankfully, Biden decided to make his decision before we went into the field. And at the last minute, we were able to adjust a few questions in order to make this poll even more timely. But it is striking that, again, comparing and contrasting this Ohio poll with Michigan 7, and Michigan 7, that's a district that Biden narrowly won in 2020, and he was losing by 8 points to Trump. And so to contrast that with now this district where Trump won by 3 in 2020, and now Harris, according to the poll, is even, that is, that's a different dynamic. Now this is one district, one poll. We'll do all the caveats. Let's see if it's a trend and not an outlier. See, maybe this is a honeymoon and that things are going to crash back to reality for Democrats, but you'd rather have these numbers, if you're a Democrat, than the alternative before the switch happened.
The most interesting thing to me in this survey, beyond the headline results, was the image ratings of the various candidates. Now, Joe Biden, we knew he was unpopular, but he is deeply unpopular in this district. He's favorability rating 36%, unfavorable rating 60%, so 24 points underwater. Trump, still unpopular, much less unpopular, 46% favorable, 52% unfavorable. Harris, dead even, 47% favorable, 47% unfavorable. All of a sudden, and this is something that I think I'm very interested in nationwide, this race has gone from one between a very unpopular candidate to a slightly less unpopular, but still unpopular candidate, to potentially one between an unpopular candidate and a popular one, or a moderately popular break-even one. And that's a really different dynamic than Trump has been able to run in over the last couple of years. I mean, we've talked so much about the double haters and how important the double haters are to this election cycle. I don't know if we're going to have double haters this election, given the early numbers that we're seeing. I think that the fact that Harris is now even on her image, if she can sustain that moving forward, I think that really means a lot for Democrats up and down the ballot.
Leah, what's your perspective either on this poll specifically, or we worked together at Inside Elections at a time when I probably told you that Inside Elections would never commission polls.
I was there for the first poll.
The North Carolina one, the only other one.
Yeah. There we
Okay.
go.
Okay.
I was there for the birth of this idea. I mean, yeah, if you can tell, I'm trying to process these numbers, thinking, the one that I found the most striking was the Senate number. And when Jacob, you introduced it by being like, Brown's up, the Democrats up by 13 points. And I was like, okay, what is it, 43-30? And we still don't know. It's like, no, Brown has 49% in this poll, which is not in a district that Trump carried. That would be a pretty remarkable performance. And then but I don't know off the top of my head how Brown did in what this district would have been in 2022.
Yeah. Well, if I'll just interject there, because Jacob has a full write-up at InsideElections.com, and Brown won the district by 17 points in 2018, his previous reelection. That statewide, it was not a particularly close race. So it's not surprising that he's kind of doing so well, and he is doing worse than what he did in 2018, but he has a little bit of room maybe to fall as long as he doesn't collapse somewhere else in the state. So that's some context. But Jacob's full article has a lot more context than we have time to get into.
I'm gonna read that right after this. And what you just said now reminds me a little bit of kind of Susan Collins. When was she last up? 2022.
2020.
2020 was 2020. When, we were talking about how, her numbers had cratered from 2014, but they were still good enough for her to win.
Democrats have to hold this seat in the House if they want to win back the majority there. Democrats have to hold this seat in the Senate if they want any hope of holding the majority in the Senate. There's no margin of error in the Senate. Maybe a little bit in the House, but no margin of error in the Senate. If Sherrod Brown is losing, Democrats are losing the Senate. Now it's time for our final segment, Look What I Found. It's the part of the show where we talk about something new or interesting that we've stumbled across over the last week. It doesn't have to be politics. It can be a movie, music, food, a new restaurant. You never know what you're going to find in Look What I Found. So Nathan, kick us off here. What's something new you stumbled across this week?
It's never politics with me. My friend Matt helped me find a band called All Hype. They're from Hawaii, but moved to Portland, Oregon. And it's pop punk, maybe aggressive pop punk. It shows that my music styles have not changed all that much in multiple decades, but their 2023 album it's just super fun to listen to. And if you are someone who's listening to this podcast and you also listen to All Hype, we probably should be friends. So reach out, because that's probably a very small circle.
So I found the 1997 science fiction thriller Gattaca, which I had never seen before. I watched it with my girlfriend a couple days ago on her recommendation, and I really enjoyed it. It's got a great cast. It's Ethan Hawke, Jude Law, Uma Thurman, Alan Arkin, even Tony Shalhoub, and Gore Vidal has a small part. I didn't even know that he acted in addition to writing. It's honestly pretty thought-provoking film, and the kind of 1990s retrofuturism vibe of it all was very fun.
Well, let's see. What have I? Oh, here's one. Have you ever seen a loon? The birds, a loon. They're they have that haunting call. They're black and white.
I don't think so. Is that are they also a minor league baseball team? But I don't think that's what you're talking about.
No. I saw one in Maine, and it was really pretty and kind of majestic, and highly recommend. Oh, and I think I saw a shark from afar. I think I saw it do the Nat Geo kind of flip out of the water, but maybe that was in my head. Having not prepared for this, these are the animals that I saw last week.
I love it. I love it, though.
Well, don't tell Trump, otherwise he won't campaign in Maine anymore.
Yeah. If you have a choice between seeing a loon and getting electrocuted by a submerged boat, like, what would you do? I don't know. That's a reach, but go ahead.
All right. Well,
we've clearly gone off the rails.
On that note, thank you for joining National Geographic's Elections podcast. That is all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining us. We looked at the effects of the switch at the top of the Democratic ticket from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris. We talked a bit about what to expect out of the vice presidential selection coming up for Harris in the next couple of days. And we rolled out our new poll in Ohio's 9th district. Thank you all for listening. At Inside Elections, we provide nonpartisan analysis of congressional, presidential, and gubernatorial races. With a combination of reporting and data, we break down the key races and bring valuable context to complex elections. Go to InsideElections.com to subscribe to the bi-weekly newsletter. We've got individual subscriptions and group packages that are tailored for association and corporate PACs. If you liked this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and rate us on your favorite platform. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe, and leave a comment. If you don't like today's episode, please email Ethan Hawke. We also wanted to thank our producers, Alan Tazinski and Melissa Lenner of Pretty Easy Podcasts, and associate producer Conrad Tolosa. Please come back and join us again next time.